Welcome to Systems Philosophy. We have been building on different paradigms and perspectives, starting with the ship of Theseus, where we take away the material components, the planks, the masts, the sails, and extract the pattern. You could philosophically debate at which point the original ship is no longer the original ship, if all the parts have been replaced, but the design is still true to the original ship. Is it still the ship? What if the design itself has started to drift and shift? And this is essentially the process of evolution that leads us to categorize. We don't see life as a continuous, drifting, exploring flame front, where the same flame that ignited with that initial cell that divided and persisted is still with us and dividing, drifting and morphing its form, tracing its lineage directly back. Dynamic equilibrium, shifting under evolutionary pressure. In the previous episode, we speculated on how primates might have followed that shifting dynamic equilibrium to cross the bridge that brings us to humans, beings like ourselves, with language, technology, and a different form of cognition. Not different like a computer has different cognition. We still have the same biological roots. We still have the same biochemistry, same sort of hormones and genetics. 98% of the genes that build the chimpanzee build the human. That 2% makes a huge difference. And the main difference is arguably the invention of the spoken word, of language. I have previously been at pains to point out that vocalization communicated meaning, much like contextual music communicates mood in a film. Culture meant we needed, and we as in mammals that transmitted culture, not just mammals, species that transmitted culture, life at that level of evolution needed to have a theory of mind capable of learning the lessons that the teacher was trying to give us. Mirror neurons, being able not just to coordinate our own motion within the learnt environment, but now equating the motion of another and translating that motion to ourselves. The classic monkey see, monkey do doesn't require language, but it requires a sophisticated pre-language brain, a shift in the unveilt, the perceived, computed environment in which action takes place, in which planning takes place, in which memory labels events so that they can be learnt and improved upon. That unveilt environment, even before the invention of language and modern humans, has become extremely sophisticated. And the fact that we can communicate with primates through sign language that we teach them suggests that much of the cognitive capability in the primate mind already existed before humans took the verbal communication further, and that made all the difference. If you imagine a communication world without language, where the sounds, and I'm smiling at the classic caveman meme of the grunts and the ugs hug the caveman, we don't know exactly when language actually evolved. So I think Ugg the caveman is doing our ancestors an injustice, because I think the higher level of communication evolved a lot further back in the evolutionary tree. Even so, if we put ourselves in the position of monkeys, where we can vocalize but we can't speak, then we're in the world of the pantomime, the game of charades, where we need to convey a message without speech. And we find, as anyone who has played charades, that it's quite difficult conveying even a simple written concept without the aid of the spoken word. And here we are conveying that message to other humans who have the same unveilt as ourselves in terms of the evolved cognitive machinery and the shared cultural philosophy and paradigm. Taking ourselves back to the unveilt of the pre-language primate is very difficult. I've tried, and I'll try and share some of those insights with you today as I try and bridge the story of humanity from the culture that has been evolving for tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years, into the cultural unlock of language and technology, the threshold upon which we now stand in this story of life that I'm weaving into systems philosophy. The mind would observe and label experience. That experience would be contextualized by emotion. So an emotional state of feeding would bring back the context relevant to food. What can I eat? What should I be looking for food? And it would fine-tune our cognition to that particular paradigm or mode of thinking. The same goes for fear. If we're in a fearful state, we're either anticipating a dangerous situation or we're already participating in one. We might be walking along and get near a place that's very much like a place that we were ambushed last. And here I'm talking about we as a being that is working with that mindset. The association starts to bring back memory. It starts to play on our emotion. We might find that our cortisol and adrenaline levels suddenly rise because of the memory. It may be the specific memory of where we were attacked. It may be that we see a predator in the distance, or it may be simply a more loose association of the conditions that are similar. Neural networks have been shown to generalize, and I'm certain that the brain has evolved to generalize because it makes sense to fine-tune our responses to environments where those responses are appropriate. The same could be said to seeing a potential mate. Suddenly, the chemicals and the actions and behaviors relevant to sexual reproduction might come in the foreground. And with a lot of mammalian biology, there is a certain time of year the rut, for instance, where often in spring, where the annual reproduction cycle has been optimized to match the food availability cycle. So the linkage is not just to the basic memory, but also to seasonal cycles. Seasonal memory. Easter, with its eggs and rabbits, is just a modern commercial phenomenon, but it symbolizes fertility. It goes back to the maypole. It goes back to the early human culture, but I digress. I'm talking about unspoken association that is complex enough to produce all the behaviors that we observe in higher primate culture. And I don't wish to go there right now, but a lot of what we humans still squabble and argue about is not so much different to chimpanzees. It's simply been transposed to different paradigms. So the fundamental machinery exists pre-language. So what does the spoken word unlock? It unlocks abstraction and it unlocks time, not in terms of memory, because memory already brought past events relevant to the future without the spoken word. What it unlocks is the ability to abstract time. We can now abstract the past and the future. We can abstract the landscape. So instead of here and now, and our thinking drifting and becoming appropriate to the situation, we can now, through labels, take our thinking into situations that are not contextual to the here and now. We begin to unlock time travel in the mind. Let me begin. When we're playing pantomimes, we can point at a tree, but the tree becomes the tree. The person becomes the person. We don't yet have the ability to abstract to a person, a tree, a rock. We can perhaps try to point at lots of rocks and through that abstract many rocks. I argue and have concluded that that concept was not part of the pre-vocal, pre-language, not pre-vocal, pre-language, unveilt. That the concept of taking a single tree and multiplying it into a forest, the concept of taking the experience of having seen many trees and abstracting it not to that tree and this tree, but a tree, is the unlock that language provides. Clearly, animals have territory, can navigate in 2 and 3 dimensions. So spatial unlock is not something that language gives us. What it unlocks is we can talk about the rock behind the hill. We can talk about the place we visited yesterday with that big tree by the river. We can begin to travel more specifically in our minds. So the mirror neurons that mirrored the behavior now become mirror neurons that allow us to travel in our virtual environment and communicate and share that travel. We may be able to, without language, remember the tree beside the river we visited. Now we can communicate that specifically. With that becomes the reflexive coupling to the evolution of the brain. Humans have evolved a larynx that is capable of speech. We have evolved the breath control that lets us speak without upsetting the delicate balance of oxygen in the bloodstream. We can breathe deeply or breathe shallowly, breathe with a steady breath or breathe out of breath when we speak. We have developed extreme adaptations to speech, including the lowering and enlarging of the larynx and the merging of the larynx with the windpipe to the lungs, so that humans are some of the few creatures who can actually choke on our food. That is a life and death trade-off that shows how important the evolution of speech has been in terms of our survival and our past. Biology would rather risk the occasional individual dying from choking and asphyxiating than lose the subtle ability to speak in sounds that convey meaning. That is how important speech has been to our basic physiology and anatomy, and I have no reason to believe that it is any less important to our cognition, because the concepts of past and future and being able to convey those concepts require a brain capable of modelling those concepts. I'm certain that many of the same mechanisms that pre-existed the visual cortex that rendered and still renders our worlds understandable has been built upon and adapted. And one of the big things that humanity has, as we enlarged our minds, our brains, and grew the neocortex, the new cortex, a huge layer of compute that takes us hugely above the ability of our nearest primates. So we may share a lot of fundamental behaviours with the chimpanzees, but in terms of cognition, we are worlds apart, and that world has been unlocked through speech and the spoken language. I'm trying to keep these episodes to around 20 to 25 minutes, and there is still a lot more to be said, but I think I have done enough to bridge the basic conceptual unlock that I was aiming for. The history of speech, like much of human prehistory, has dissolved into the ether as the recoverable traces are simple fossils and no longer complex written histories. Those fossils are starting to speak to us with DNA unlocks now, so we can go further than the basic anatomy that we could 20 years ago. A lot of what happened in the time between our distant primate ancestors and modern humans has to be inferred. It's in the realm of speculation and philosophy. And part of what I have done with this session is try to rationally bridge the gaps between what I understand in terms of biology and primates and the pattern that I have been weaving, the fact that culture predates humanity, which is something not spoken of very often, the fact that vocalization communicated before language was discovered, and the sort of communication and coupling of minds that created, the fact that culture already created mirror neurons, that complex social primate behaviour already enabled complex theory of mind, being able to model the motivation of others. But today I have made the case for speech creating a fundamental shift, not just in communications capability, but in biological cognitive ability, from the incredible modulation of the breath that we have in order to speak, from the anatomical differences in the larynx and in breath control, to the anatomical differences in the brain, from not just the neocortex, but also the specialized regions for processing the concepts and capabilities that speech allowed us to communicate. And I think that is a very nice place to end. And for the next episode, we're looking more at the sort of things that we do communicate, the sort of unlocks that speech have given us, being able to talk about time and place, abstraction, numbers, mathematics, all the things that speech gives us, being able not just to talk about our experiences in terms of experiencing what we communicate in a lifetime and perhaps pantomiming those experiences. We can now talk about individuals and other lifetimes. We can model contextual experiences. These are all teasers, if you like, for where I think this philosophy takes us next. For now, this has been another sunrise on the Southern Ocean, the Tasman Sea, near St Helens in northeast Tasmania. And you've been watching Systems Philosophy.